Just yesterday, the President signed an executive order calling for a review of monument designations across the United States, with a specific focus on 2 national monuments that have caused significant damage in my home state. That is the home state of Utah, Bears Ears and the Grand Staircase, Escalante. Yesterday's executive action is the culmination of countless hours of hard work and close coordination with the White House. When I first spoke with President Trump in the Oval Office during his first week on the job, I asked for his help in addressing the Bears Ear debacle. From day one, our president has been committed to helping us fix this disaster and ensuring that our smallest counties get a fair shake. Mr. President, throughout my Senate service, I have fought to give voice to the needs of our rural communities in the debate over public lands. Too often, past presidents have ignored the concerns of Utah's families in declaring massive monuments that threaten the Western way of life. And too often, presidents have abused the authority under the Antiquities Act to satisfy the demands of an extreme environmental agenda. But no more. Following yesterday's executive order, I look forward to working with the Trump administration to address past abuses and restore the original meaning of the Antiquities Act. The President's executive order directs Secretary of Interior Ryan Zinke to review dozens of national monuments. Now, this is a welcome opportunity to set a new precedent for the responsible use of the Antiquities Act, a precedent that will take into account the needs of locals and foster greater trust between the states and the federal government as we work toward a shared goal of preserving our cultural antiquities. For decades, I have sought to rein in executive abuse under the Antiquities Act. That's why I traveled to Bears Ears just last week to hear firsthand from the local residents and tribal members who have been hurt most by this monument designation. And that's why, in the opening days of his presidency, I met personally with President Trump in the Oval Office to discuss the public lands issue at length. I made clear to the President that Utahns have had enough of monument designations that come down unilaterally with zero support from locals, state officials, or Congress. Many of my own considerations have had many of my own constituents have had their lives upended by this abuse of executive power. For too long, Utahns, many of whom depend on public lands for their very livelihood, have been at the mercy of out-of-touch bureaucrats who have little knowledge or personal connection to the land. President Obama only made their situation worse when he spurned the men and women of San Juan County by declaring the Bears Ears National Monument last December. In doing so, he defied the will of the state legislature, the governor, and the entire Utah congressional delegation. President Obama's last-minute monument designation imposed even greater land use restrictions on a region that is already predominantly controlled by the federal government. Now, Mr. President, as I've said before, in opposing the Bears Ears monument designation, I'm in no way opposing the protection of lands that need to be protected. Indeed, there are many cultural sites in Utah that warrant preservation. And I am committed to working with the President and with Congress to protect these sacred places for future generations. But as I have also said previously, I believe it is both unlawful and undemocratic for any president to seize millions upon millions of acres of land through the Antiquities Act, a law that was geared to give the President only narrow authority to designate special landmarks such as a unique natural arch or the site of old cliff dwellings. We desperately need a new process for creating national monuments. Congress and impacted local communities, not the President alone, should have a say in decisions that restrict access to millions of acres of federally owned land. In making such decisions, the voice of the people is paramount. And And let me be clear, abusing the Antiquities Act at the expense of local communities is not a sustainable public lands strategy. This strategy is counterintuitive because it puts Antiquities Act authority at great risk. The Antiquities Act was designed to provide specific protections for objects of antiquity. But out west, particularly in Utah, the law has become synonymous with land grabs and federal overreach. Restoring the legitimacy of Antiquities Act authority in the eyes of Westerners requires a more measured approach to monument designations, an approach that takes into account the needs of locals and restores trust between states and the federal government. To be clear, I have no objection when presidents use the Antiquities Act according to its original purpose, which was to protect cultural antiquities by designating the minimum acreage necessary. Take, for example, the great state of Washington, which is home to several national monuments that were created in line with the law's original intent. The state's beautiful San Juan Islands cover only 970 acres, while the Hanford Reach encompasses 195,000 acres. At first glance, this amount of acreage may seem large, but compared to Utah's two most prominent national monuments, it's a tiny speck on the map. In fact, the total acreage of the San Juan Islands and Hanford Ranch combined is only 6% of the size of Bears Ears and Grand Staircase Escalante national monuments. In the state of Washington, presidents have used the Antiquities Act within reason. Unfortunately, the same cannot be said for my home state of Utah, where presidents have repeatedly abused their authority under the law to declare 8 national monuments that together span more than 3.3 million acres. In Utah, national monuments cover roughly 10% of all federal land in a state where 67% of the land is already owned and dominated by the federal government. By contrast, only 28% of the land in the state of Washington is owned by the federal government. And of that federal land, only 1.6% is locked away as a national monument. It's no wonder, then, that Utahns feel more threatened by the Antiquities Act than Washingtonians. This is a law that past presidents have brandished as a weapon to cut up entire sections of our state. Mr. President, this is far from the first time that I've taken to this floor to speak out against the Antiquities Act abuse. And it certainly won't be the last, but I'm encouraged by yesterday's executive order with President Trump and Secretary Zinke on our side. I believe that we can plot a path forward to correct past abuses and forge a new precedent for future monument designations. The President's executive action signifies a critical milestone in the effort to include local voices in the management of our public lands. As the Trump administration reviews various national monuments, we must replace the top-down approach of past administrations with a grassroots strategy that engages local leaders, state officials, and members of Congress in the decision-making process. Bringing all stakeholders, to the table is essential to establish a new precedent that will undo the decades of abuse we have endured under, I think, false interpretations of the Antiquities Act. I'm eager to continue working with the President and the Secretary of the Interior to preserve our nation's cultural treasures in a way that honors the original meaning of the Antiquities Act. I am likewise eager to involve locals in that process. With all parties working together, I firmly believe we can restore a relationship of trust between the states and the federal government in the management of public lands. Now, I'm grateful, Mr. President, for a president who is willing to work with us to reset the status quo. Better than any of his predecessors, President Trump understands the lasting damage wrought by past presidents under the Antiquities Act. Indeed, in all my years of public service, I've never seen a president so committed to reining in the federal government and so eager to address the problems caused by these overreaching monument designations. I wish to thank President Trump and Secretary Zinke for taking concrete steps to rein in abuse through yesterday's executive order. I also wish to thank the President's Chief of Staff, Reince Priebus, who helped make yesterday's victory possible. Reince has done exceptionally well in one of the toughest jobs in all of Washington. The President is lucky to have Reince in the White House, and I am lucky to call him a friend. I also wish to thank my former Chief of Staff, Rob Porter, who is now a special assistant to the President and the staff secretary at the White House. Rob is an invaluable asset to the President's team and ours as well. And without him, yesterday's executive order would never have come to fruition, at least in my opinion. Rob was among the finest men ever to serve as my Chief of Staff, and I've enjoyed watching him succeed at the White House. Now, Mr. President, yesterday we took a meaningful first step to fix past abuses under the Antiquities Act. Yet there is still much work to be done, and I look forward to working with the White House every step of the way.